So it's just a testament to all of Caleb's friends and everybody. That has supported him over the last few years. Yeah. In terms of what to say about Caleb, I'd love to just talk about the science, but I have to tell you that it has been an adventure working with this guy. He has increased my reputation of trying to kill my grad students tenfold. What has happened with him? And he came into my lab not really knowing the animals that we worked with. So my first experience with Caleb was walking onto Año Nuevo and having him just like looking around, and a male elephant seal trying to plow him down from behind and then grab him out of that path. Then I took him to Africa, and that was fantastic. He got a chance to work on our lion project. He was amazing as a person in the field. People loved Caleb. The Kenyans were just amazed with him, but mostly amazed with the amount of food that he can. Somalia's right next door, and it was just like they couldn't believe he could fill a plate 10 times and keep it going. But my memory from Africa with him is him driving in a vehicle in a Land Rover in front of my Land Rover, and then inexplicably running out of jumping out of the driver's seat and running into the bushes where there's lions, and I'm thinking, is he trying to kill himself? So it's not my fault when these things happen. But he just wanted a picture of the sunset. So that's Caleb. But then I took him to the Antarctic where there weren't any lions, and I thought things were safe. But then he became the first student I've ever had go into full-blown hypothermia, and we had to do the whole taco roll and put him in front of a fire and such. So I'll let him explain how he got himself into that situation. But it involved lack of food and not changing his socks, but there were a lot of things that he almost became a statistic for me. And then there was his thesis project, where I told him he could not have a project on wolves without seeing the wolves. I mean, at one point, his collaborators, and he did an amazing job getting those collaborators, but the collaborators in Denali said, just send the collars up and we'll deploy them, and you can sit on your computer and see the GPS downloads, and then we'll bring the collars back. And I said, no, you have got to go up, you have got to see the environment these animals are running around in, and just experience it at some level so that you understand the challenges that these animals are faced with. And he did that. But we warned him about going in small aircraft and doing surveys. And I've never known a person that could throw up 9 times in less than, what, was it an hour, 2 hours? It was amazing. And then get out of that plane and go in the next day. I can tell you, if I had thrown up 9 times in a plane, I would never get in that plane. And Caleb, to his credit, got right back in there and didn't throw up. He did really well, but you just going, this guy is amazing. And then he remembered what I had said about experiencing what the wolves were experiencing. So he invited a friend, and they were going to go out into the wilds and just try to track down some of these wolves. And he did, but then he got frostbite on his hands the very first day. I've never seen such a bad case of frostbite where you didn't lose your fingers, but he didn't. So it's all good. And then it was the first day, and yet he took those frozen hands and went out for a week.
3 weeks.
3 weeks. So, this is how insane it was, but went out for 3 weeks in freezing cold temperatures to follow these animals, and that just epitomizes Caleb. This project that he's done, I'm so proud of him for having done it because it's his. We talked about it. I was so busy with the field work, and the other students are working on their own projects. Every single data point here was selected by Caleb, And the ideas are Caleb's, the analysis is Caleb's. And he's very adept at getting groups of people together and getting the thinking going and such. So he stands out as an amazing scientist, an amazing writer. I use him as my editor for grants for everything. So he's extremely talented, and I could go on about all of it, but I'm going to let him talk about his thesis because I want you to get past goofy Caleb and to the point of seeing him as the PhD that he richly deserves. So with that, do your thing.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm not really deserving of most of this comment, that's all you know. But, the first thing I want to say is, so Terry mentioned that. Did I hit the lights? Oh, thank you. So Terry mentioned that I did this whole project by myself, which to a very minor extent is true, and bits and pieces are mine. But really, science is such a collaborative effort, and whenever I say I in this presentation by mistake, I really mean we, because I had a huge group of people working with me and on whose shoulders I was standing. So if I don't mention you specifically in this talk or at the acknowledgements, I'm really grateful for all the contributions you've given along the way. And for everyone in this room, thank you so much for braving the insanity of the weather that was out there to get here. Whether you came from across the country or across the parking lot, it was an epic journey for most of us today. Without further ado, here's sort of the highlight reel of my graduate school experience. So for all organisms, the ability to grow and be active and thermoregulate, it's all dependent on metabolic energy. And an animal's ability to balance its energy budget really depends on that animal's ability to acquire resources. And so in the study of animal energetics, we're really able to unite the fields of physiology and ecology. And energy itself is a common currency that allows us to unite those fields. And it allows us to look at the individual performance of organisms, but also to link those to the ecology of communities that are part of, their populations, and the ecosystem in general. So we can think about the importance of energy with a voracious little predator that's probably sitting off the coast a couple hundred feet behind me, the sea otter. So a sea otter's metabolic rate sets the rate at which it can uptake, and it needs to uptake, resources from its environment. But it also sets the rate at which it can allocate those resources to things like activity, thermoregulation, or staying warm in a cold environment, and reproduction. So my thesis work really focused on large terrestrial carnivores, so I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about those. They tend to have large territories, and they have high prey requirements, and they exist at low densities on the landscape, in part due to their low reproductive rates. And as many of us in this room know, large carnivores are critical in structuring ecosystems. And just because these animals typically exist at low densities on the landscape doesn't mean they're ecologically irrelevant. In fact, quite the opposite is true. So many studies, including many by people in this room, have shown that just the presence of a few top carnivores in an ecosystem can radically shape the structure of that whole biome. So let's take an oversimplified example here, where we've got wolves, elk, and shrubs. So through herbivory, elk populations can regulate shrub abundance. And through predation, wolves can regulate elk abundance. So in effect, wolves actually have a positive indirect benefit on shrubs and primary productivity in general. And having a more green planet can actually support more birds. It can change the morphology of streams. It can even allow beavers to come back into an ecosystem like Yellowstone, where they were sort of gone for a while. So the high metabolic rates of these large carnivores are driven by three primary things: their large body mass, their need to thermoregulate, and the fact that many of these animals are obligate carnivores. And as such, if I could turn this down, let's get a little cough. Oh, okay. Trust me, down the bottom stuff here. As such, they're often coming into direct conflict with humans and livestock populations. Many large carnivores are facing global threats, whether that's habitat loss and fragmentation, whether it's direct persecution or the loss of their prey species. In fact, the IUCN recently reevaluated the status of mammals worldwide and found that a whopping almost 1/4 of all mammal species are already endangered or extinct in the wild. And that number is even higher for terrestrial carnivores. Okay, so energy expenditure is largely modulated by locomotion, just the cost of being active in overcoming the forces of friction and gravity that move about the landscape. And of course, with many of these large predators, they're difficult to observe in the wild. And measuring their energetic rates and their activity patterns in situ out in the field has been all but impossible. And yet doing so is absolutely critical for forming our understanding of their foraging patterns, their resource requirements, and ultimately how we design corridors and reserves to protect not only the large carnivores, but the species they depend on. So my dissertation work focused specifically on the family Canidae, which is comprised of 35 extant species, and they exist on every continent except Antarctica. Of course, they're incredibly diverse. So all those 35 species range from little fennec foxes to big wolves. And all of them, including domesticated dogs, are considered elite mammalian athletes. So in this figure we see, here we go. Can you guys see this?
Yep.
Okay. So this is oxygen consumption or metabolic rate as a function of body mass. And this blue line is the basal metabolic rate of all these animals. And for canids in particular, large canids, they're able to really utilize oxygen for exercise. So they can actually upregulate their metabolic rate by about 30 times from resting to maximum exertion. And just by comparison, even the most elite human performers can only upregulate their metabolism by 15 or 20 times. So most of us in this room are probably closer to 10 or 12. Myself included. Okay. So out in the wild, large canids are highly cursorial, meaning they have to chase down their prey over long distances in order to survive. So the combined effects of our difficulty in observing these animals directly and their ecological importance on the landscape and the fabric of that landscape makes studying their detailed movement ecology really, really critical for informing conservation efforts. Okay, so that's exactly what I set out to do in my dissertation, to study the foraging ecology and the movement patterns, the energy expenditure of canids on the landscape. Before I started working with wolves, though, I figured it would be great to start out with a much more tractable model organism, which is the domestic dog, and you've all met Kita. I worked with dogs to study the effects of artificial selection on physiology and running performance. The next chapter I'll walk you through is a really unique opportunistic study that I did where we actually compared the energetics and the running performance of canids and felids out in the wild. So we looked at hounds and mountain lions. And then finally, I've given you sort of I will give you a sense for some lab work we can do, some sort of pseudo predator-prey interactions, but I really want to focus on the seasonal wolf movement patterns up in Alaska because it shows you the capability of the sensors that we've been developing. Okay, first though, the dogs. So domestic dogs have, well, dogs are actually the oldest domesticated species. They diverged from wolves over 15,000 years ago. And of course, they come in all shapes and sizes today. There's over 400 recognized dog breeds. And dogs themselves actually have the highest sustained metabolic rate of any species measured. And at each step along the pathway for oxygen, they have unique structural and functional adaptations that allow for this. So whether it's in the lungs, the heart, the muscles, or even the mitochondria within the muscle cells, they're able to really utilize oxygen, unlike any other species. So the effects and origins of domestication in dogs have recently been explored by a variety of disciplines in biology, but there are still many unanswered physiological questions. So the first questions I set out to address were, first and foremost, how variable is performance and energy across dog breeds that we might think are otherwise similar? And then secondly, has the economy of dog breed movement been optimized or disrupted over time? So And by that I mean in comparison to all dog breeds' ancestors, the gray wolf. So to conduct this study, I worked with a number of different dog breeds, and thank you to many of you in this room who volunteered your dog for science for the project. So those breeds included northern breeds like Kita, hounds, and retrievers. And there are 23 dogs in total that I worked with. All of them were working class breeds. And I controlled for a variety of things: age, mass, morphology, and health. Now the first comparison I made across these breeds was just the basic biomechanics. So I went out in the field and used high-speed videography to measure the preferred speeds and the gait transitions of all these different dog breeds. I then looked at more detailed kinematics from these animals by digitizing 24 different anatomical landmarks. You can just think of that as like points on a joint that's moving during walking, trotting, and galloping gaits. And that allowed me to compare whole body and limb dynamics. And last but not least, I looked at the running physiology and the exercise energetics of the animal. Let's see if this plays. So here's Kita, again, we've all met her. And I trained a subset of these 23 dogs to run on the treadmill, and we used a technique called open flow respirometry, which allows us to measure the metabolic rates of the animals as they're enclosed inside this plastic box. And let's see if this works. Yeah. So here we have the percentage of oxygen inside the chamber and the duration of the experiment. And as we start the experiment here, you can see there's a drop in the percentage of oxygen, basically because the animal's consuming that oxygen. And the depth of this depletion curve can then be converted to a caloric expenditure. So that's how we mapped out the energetics of these different dog breeds. So jumping right into our results. First we looked again at biomechanics, and we found a surprising variation in the preferred speeds and gait transitions of these different dog breeds. But in order to situate my small sample size of 3 different breeds in a larger context, I looked at the pioneering work of Higland and Taylor, who in the 80s developed allometric regressions from 16 wild and domesticated species, ranging in size from mice to horses. And they found something really interesting. They noticed that the trot to gallop transition speed is physiologically equivalent across all these different species of all these sizes. So what we wanted to do was focus on that trot to gallop transition speed. And as you can see here, we have stride frequency for northern breed dogs and speed along the x-axis, and the measured speed at which we actually detected these dogs preferring to switch from trot to gallop was not significantly different from those allometric predictions from the 80s. The same was true from our hounds. But when we got to the retriever dogs, we actually noticed they preferred to transition from a trot to a gallop at a much faster speed than predicted by the velometry. Then we looked at the kinematics of the animals, and we found, fortunately, there was no treadmill effect, meaning the kinematics that we measured while the dogs were running outside naturally was the exact same as the kinematics as they were being trained to run the treadmill. We also noted that only trotting kinematics differed among the groups, so walking and galloping did not. Then we looked at the vertical displacement, which you can think of as the bounciness of the gait. As we might expect, a walk typically has a smaller bounce than a trot, which is smaller than a gallop, right? That's what we found for the hounds and retrievers. We actually didn't see that pattern consistent in the northern breed dogs. We noticed that the walking gait had a greater vertical displacement than the trot. And then, of course, the gallop, because all 4 limbs are off the ground at one time, was bouncy again. But the trot actually seemed to be really stable in these northern breed dogs. And when we looked into what might be going on, it turns out there may be an Achilles tendon spring dampening mechanism, which can reduce damaging vibrations, enhance forward propulsion, and conserve energy at speed. So given the fact that this is a potential energy saving mechanism, we wanted to map out the energetics, which we did. So here we have speed along the x-axis and metabolic rate, or oxygen consumption, on the y. And as you can see, there's a positive linear relationship for all these groups. So of course, faster speeds demand more energy. That's not a big surprise. What was interesting was that the northern breed dogs were significantly higher, or excuse me, the hounds were significantly higher than both the northern breeds and retrievers. And this might be due to the fact that at any given speed, so say 2 meters per second, they actually had faster stride frequencies and longer stride lengths. So they're just running differently. And also note here that the northern breed dogs in green were by far the lowest of these different breed comparisons, except for at the very lowest of walking speeds. Okay, so another way to look at the energetics of animals is with their cost of transport, which is basically the energy that they invest to move 1 kilogram of body mass over 1 unit of distance, which is a meter. So it's a good way to standardize across individuals. And the total cost of transport for these animals includes locomotion, posture, and maintenance costs. And we were not surprised to see that overall faster speeds have lower transport costs. But what was interesting was that these northern breeds, again, I've highlighted them in green, but they're going to be these darkish boxes in each of the walk, trot, and gallop panels. The northern breeds actually have lower total cost of transport than any of the other dog breeds we looked at. The same was true for net cost of transport. So we basically factored out the costs associated with maintenance metabolism. And again, lower for northern breed dogs. Then we looked at the cost per step. So how many joules of energy is each dog investing to put 1 foot on the ground? And once again, lower for northern breeds. These are significant results. Then we wanted to disentangle the relative impact of metabolism, or excuse me, of locomotion and maintenance metabolism. So what we see here is that the fact that this overall bar is much lower is showing that the locomotor costs are really the cost savings for the northern breeds, since their maintenance costs are similar. We then wanted to take another step back and say, how do these 3 dog breeds compare to other dogs that have been measured in the past? And this is an allometric regression from Dick Taylor's lab, and they looked at cost of transport in all running mammals. And what we can see is our little triangles here, the hounds, retrievers, and northern breed dogs. They're all well below the predicted allometric regression for total cost of transport. So basically, all these animals are running cheaper than expected, just by body mass. But this was particularly true for the northern breed dogs. So again, the northern breed dogs are really, really cost efficient. What makes them cost efficient? Well, there's 2 general mechanisms at work. The first is during the walking gait, called the inverted pendulum. And you can think about this as an exchange between potential and kinetic energy through the body's center of mass. So it's kind of like vaulting over a stiff limb. So the limb is stiff, and you're just sort of vaulting your center of mass over it. At the faster speeds, so at trotting and galloping, there are elastic structures in play. And those are the tendons and ligaments. And so during the spring mass mechanism, there's actually elastic storage and release as the limb touches down and then lifts off. So we think that might be more optimized in northern breeds and wolves. And we certainly have evidence from the wild that suggests this. I think that's why we see northern breed dogs and not poodles running in the Iditarod. Okay, so what about the proximate mechanisms? What could we actually measure in the lab? Well, we saw that the standing hip angle, which is basically the angle of the back legs relative to the back, for the 3 breeds we looked at, compared to wolves, well, for northern breeds, they had a much more wolf-like stance. And that is to say, they keep their hind limbs more tucked underneath their body as they're standing, presumably as they're running, just how they orient themselves. And it turns out that having a closer alignment with the ground reaction force vector of the hind limbs causes a mechanical advantage for loading those tendons and ligaments. Okay, we also noticed that the head angle while running was really different across these breeds. So going from retrievers to hounds to northerns, they kept their heads down more and more in this progression. So retrievers and northern dogs, or excuse me, retrievers and hounds they tended to keep their heads up more, and excuse me, so many breeds here. Northern breeds tended to keep their heads more level, sort of like a wolf. And having that flat top line actually alters the forelimb kinematics and can change the stride length and stride frequency. And that can have sort of consequences for the energetics of the locomotion itself. Okay, so to wrap up this first chapter, I found that there was indeed empirical support that there's reduced transport costs in dogs more closely related to wolves. So those northern breed dogs are more genetically similar to wolves than other breeds. Forgot to mention that. And that's another way of saying that is just that selection has altered the physiological foundation from wolves in some breeds more than others. So if we think about this in terms of an energetic trade-off, we have the retrievers and hounds capable of achieving faster top speeds, but they have a cost of reduced endurance capacity. Whereas on sort of the other end of the energetic spectrum, we have dogs like northern breeds and wolves, which are better at endurance, but might not be capable of achieving top speeds. Okay, so we looked at biomechanics, energetics, and kinematics in the laboratory. I'm going to now share with you a really neat opportunistic study we had to take these types of measurements out into the field and see how they play out with wild animals. So performance capacity really does impact survival. And the ability of scientists to measure these things in fine detail, so the performance capacity, the turning, the maneuvering, it has really, really fundamental implications for how we understand predator-prey interactions. So from a large carnivore's perspective, the ability to make a kill is critical for survival. And of course, for the prey items perspective, the ability to escape predation is critical for survival. And in some species pairs, like cheetahs and gazelles, there's a co-evolutionary arms race going on, where each species is sort of co-evolving specialized morphologies and behavioral strategies that allow it to outdo the other. So whether that's achieving top speed so it can run away or catch the gazelle, or maneuvering or what have you. And of course, the strength of selection acting on the predator and prey can be asymmetric. In other words, there's the life dinner principle where the cost of missing a meal is obviously less than the cost of becoming a meal. So there are 4 traditional phases in terrestrial hunts. The searching phase, the stalking phase, the attack itself, and the subdue phase. Now we know that the attack is, for most predators, the most power-demanding phase. And the behavioral responses of turning, maneuvering, speed, and acceleration, those are the most critical for both predator and prey survival. And of course, outside the Serengeti of Africa, let's say, it's pretty difficult to actually observe large carnivore interactions and predation events in the wild. And hunting in large felids and canids actually differs. So large canids and felids have sort of evolved divergent hunting mode tactics, and there's physiological consequences associated with those. So for instance, let's say we have a large felid like a mountain lion here in Santa Cruz. They're solitary hunters, and they rely on speed and power to surprise and subdue their prey. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, let's say, a wolf or a large canid, which utilizes a charge and chase strategy to chase down its prey over long distances. And these guys are also social hunters, so they hunt in packs. So this divergence in hunting mode actually enables the coexistence of large canids and felids on the landscape through spatiotemporal niche diversification and dietary diversification. And again, we had a really unique opportunity to observe the pursuit and evasion tactics of these predators and prey, or predators and prey, if you will, in situ in the wild. That project took place right here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which, as many of us know, are sort of hemmed in by urban landscapes or urbanscapes to the north and south and the Pacific to the west. And the top carnivore around here is the mountain lion, which has to coexist with other small carnivores, but it primarily preys on deer. Our objective was to quantify the free-ranging behavior, energetics, and pursuit escape dynamics and tactics of hounds and pumas during recapture. So the mountain lion population in Santa Cruz has been studied through Chris Wilmers' lab for about 10 years or so now. And they have an ongoing effort to recall our animals that were wearing GPS and accelerometer collars. So what we did was we actually simultaneously instrumented the hounds that we used to recapture these mountain lions to outfit their batteries, or to put clean batteries in, if you will, at the same time that the batteries were starting to run out on the older mountain lion collars. So we were able to simultaneously measure the chase and pursuit dynamics in real time, which again is a pretty unique opportunity. The main questions I was interested in were, first and foremost, how do the anatomical and physiological capacities of canids and felids differ, and how do they affect maximal performance? And traditionally, we know that larger animals tend to be capable of achieving greater speeds, but at the cost of reduced turning capacity. And we weren't quite sure how this was going to play out because mountain lions are over twice the size of the hounds in our study. But they've also evolved to be really good hunters in a very steeply wooded landscape. So maybe they have better turning capacity than we'd expect given the fact that they're twice the size of the hounds. Next, we wanted to know how these performance parameters actually influence the chase strategies and outcomes in the field. Okay, so how do we go about measuring all this? Well, again, we used a laboratory to field approach where we developed an accelerometer GPS collar. And each behavior that an animal makes while wearing an accelerometer, whether it's on the neck or on the body somewhere, each behavior is going to generate a unique accelerometer signature. And based on studies with both hounds and mountain lions in the laboratory, we can then match the energetics and biomechanics of these animals using accelerometer signatures to the chase outcomes that we observe in the field. So again, the accelerometer was really the link between the laboratory and the field. Okay, what chase parameters were we interested in quantifying? Well, from the landscape, we wanted to look at both the duration and the distance of the chase and escape, the topography of the landscape, so how did elevation and slope factor in? And from each animal, we wanted to look at speed, the percent time stationary versus moving, the route tortuosity, or the turning of the animals, and then the leading and trailing distance, so how far behind the mountain lions were the hounds at any given time. And of course, being a physiologist, we're always interested in measuring metabolic costs and energetics, both at the phase of the hunt level and of the total hunt itself. So we had an opportunity to do 4 of these recapture events, 2 with mountain lion 26M and 2 with puma 36M. If I use puma and mountain lion interchangeably, I'm sorry, I'll try to stick with puma from now on. Same thing. For the sake of time and illustration, I'm only going to show you the results from one of our chases of puma 36M. So rather than taking you guys all out into the field to get poison oak like I did, I brought the field to you, and I've, let's see if I can get this to play. So this is going to be a Google Earth visualization in real time, or sorry, not real time. This is a 7-minute chasing bout that I've collapsed down to 30 seconds. And what I want you to be aware of as I orient you is the fact that there are 5 hounds down here in the bottom of this valley. They're going to chase up here and detect the mountain lion, and then the chase is going to ensue over here. But we're actually walking the hounds up until this point, waiting for them to catch the scent of the mountain lion. We take them off the leash, and the chase goes from there. So this occurred just outside of Davenport, because you know where this is. So again, 5 hounds here, starting to come up the canyon. And right about now, they're detecting the scent of the mountain lion, who's currently unaware of their presence. Figures it out, starts sprinting off, and slowly escapes uphill. But what you may not have caught, and I'll show you a different perspective of this, is that the mountain lion did a really interesting evasive maneuver. He sort of ran a figure 8 on the landscape down here, which if you're a scent hound is going to be totally confusing to you as to where the heck the mountain lion is, because the scent is fresh everywhere all of a sudden. Okay, so here's that same chase overlaid on a digital elevation model. Again, here's down canyon and up canyon, and this is just the elevation profile of the chase. You can see it's overall uphill. This is where the hounds picked up the scent. This is where the mountain lion started, so mountain lion in blue, hounds in red. And the first thing we noticed when we started looking at the accelerometer data was that the overall dynamic body acceleration, so just how much the mountain lion was moving around, is much more variable for the puma than the hounds. So you see these big blue spikes and sort of troughs in the blue area, whereas the hounds were much more constant over time. When we looked at speed over the duration of the chase, we saw, again, much more variable for the puma. So these big spikes in speed, but also some basically like either creeping around or being completely stationary segments. And for those of you in the back of the room, it might be kind of hard to see this, but I've put the means in these horizontal bars. And even though the mountain lions was much more variable than the hounds, the means are actually similar, which is kind of interesting. Then looked at the energetic cost associated with the escape and the pursuit. And you can see, again, the mountain lion had a much more variable cost over time. So these big spikes above this solid line are actually when the animal is anaerobic. So it's basically producing muscle lactate faster than it can be consumed. And sort of to contrast, here's the hound energetic trace, and it's much more level compared to these really jagged peaks and valleys of the puma. So here's the hound's VO2 max, and they're way down here, whereas the dotted line, the mean VO2 max for the mean oxygen consumption, for the pumas was pretty much at their anaerobic threshold. When we looked at the turning and maneuvering of the animals, we found that the mountain lions were actually more variable and wider than that of the hounds. Okay, we then looked at trailing distance. So how far behind the mountain lion were the hounds at any given time? And as you can see, for the first 3 minutes of the chase, the hounds really caught up quick. They went from almost 350 meters behind to within 40 meters. But if you recall, that's right at the time where the mountain lion did that super unique figure 8 maneuver on the landscape, and essentially bought himself 5 minutes of escape time to slowly go up the hill unnoticed. He actually increased his distance between the hounds too, which is kind of unique. Okay, so what about the energetics? How'd these pan out? Well, you'll notice that the hounds actually ran for about 3 times the distance over the same duration as the mountain lion, and yet the mountain lion costs were about, let's see if I can go back, there we go. The energetic costs for the mountain lion were significantly higher, both in terms of metabolic rate, mass-specific metabolic rate, directly comparable across the species, and the cost of transport. So basically this 6-minute escape for the mountain lion was equivalent to about 25 minutes worth of routine hunting costs. Or on a per minute basis, escaping costs almost 3.5 times as much as just hunting around the landscape. It's really costly to escape if you're a mountain lion. Okay, we then looked at the variability across all 4 of these escapes for the mountain lion. And this is just the accelerometer profile. So this is chase 1, which I've shown you in more detail. But I just wanted to show you on the same axes, again, acceleration over time, just how variable these acceleration surges can be. And we actually clocked the plus or minus 6g acceleration on this last chase, which lasted only a minute. But to put that in a context for you guys, that's greater than that which is experienced by Olympic luge athletes. So these mountain lions were twisting and turning all over the place to get away from the hounds, even in 1 minute's time. When we looked at the speed results, again, combined by all 4 chases, we found something interesting, and that is that the actual average speed for the hounds was over twice that of the mountain lions. However, the mountain lions did have this little peak, so each of their escapes had one little burst of speed in it. And again, to put this more in a human context, that's about 13 or so miles an hour, and that's equivalent to Ryan Hall's US marathon record pace, about 4:45 per mile for 26 miles. No big deal. Can't imagine that. Okay, the last part of this story was I shared with you guys a little bit about how the hounds and the pumas were moving in relation to each other. But what about within the puma group, or excuse me, the hound group itself? Were they cohesive? Were they spread apart on the landscape? What did that look like? And thank you, Liz and Kieran, for helping me with this. What you should notice is that some of these pursuits by the hounds are really, really tightly grouped. So the hounds, here's a sort of the kernel density plot showing how tightly they are in space next to one another. So some of the escapes, some of the pursuits, excuse me, they're really grouped up. And in others, like in chase 4, that one I showed you with a really high maneuverability on the mountain lion, they're more spread out. So if we had more of a chance to do more chases, which maybe in the future we will, I'd really like to look at how the number of hounds in these hound groups affects the spacing, how the age and sex class of these hounds affects it, how the experience level, so is this the first chase for a hound, or is this its 100th chase, and how habitat complexity affects these grouping dynamics in the hounds. So what I've shown you is that there's actually species-specific strategies going on here. And when the mountain lions were chased, although they were overall slower, they did utilize the terrain and these evasive maneuvers to get away. And I think that's partly due to the fact that they were compensating for the fact that they're at or above their VO2 max, their anaerobic threshold. In contrast, the hounds, while they were pursuing the mountain lions, were less maneuverable. They were faster overall, but less maneuverable, and they worked as a pack. and remained completely aerobic for the entire duration of the pursuit. So again, thinking about energetic trade-offs, we were actually able to use animal-borne technology in the field to detect anatomical and physiological constraints playing out on the landscape. And it's just important to note here that mountain lions, in comparison to hounds and wolves, have smaller relative heart masses and lung capacities. So they're just overall less aerobic, and they've evolved to hunt prey in such a way that they don't need to be aerobic. Okay, lastly, I'd like to focus on a bit broader of a time frame, so going from a matter of minutes to 8 months, and share with you a story about seasonal wolf movements in Alaska. I think I've already alluded to the fact that gray wolves are both charismatic and controversial as a species. And perhaps among the biologists in this room, they're best known for their ability to structure ecosystems through both behaviorally and density-mediated trophic cascades. So what that really means is, although wolves might have a few direct links in an ecosystem, say through predation on coyotes and elk, they have a whole network of indirect effects through these trophic cascades. So the presence of wolves can actually alter the abundance of woody plants, change streams, bring beavers back, etc. So the combined effects of their high trophic status and the fact that they're social foragers, meaning they hunt in packs, means that they have really elevated prey demands. And to further exacerbate this, 65 to 85% of wolf hunts are unsuccessful. So they have to be moving really, really huge distances on the landscape just to find enough prey that's vulnerable for them to kill. And as you can imagine, any disturbance that increases their hunting effort could render their populations vulnerable to decline. And of course, it's also no surprise that since the dawn of history, humans and wolves have had a very adversarial relationship. So I think studying more detailed movement ecology in these animals can allow us to not only mitigate conflict, but promote their really incredible ecosystem structuring roles in the habitats they live in. So for this project, I went to Denali National Park in interior Alaska. It's about the same size as the state of Massachusetts or New Hampshire. And relative to other national parks with wolves like Yellowstone, there's a really low human presence and impact in Denali. Now Denali currently supports about 50 wolves, and these wolves have been studied since Adolph Murray's really pioneering work in the field of animal behavior in the 1930s. However, recently they've been experiencing a pretty significant decline. And the purported drivers of this decline are both illegal human harvest and starvation. So our objectives were therefore to quantify the effects of prey and habitat heterogeneity on the wolf movement patterns in interior Alaska and also their energetics. And if possible, to provide some management insights into this recent population decline, which is really particularly occurring in the western part of the park. So my main questions were, first of all, how does habitat and prey heterogeneity impact a whole slew of things, including wolf pack size, territory size, wolf density, and then activity patterns, movement rates, and energy expenditure. I also wanted to look at how does pack reproductive success impact activity patterns, movement rates, and energy expenditure. But for the sake of time, I'm only going to go into the results from this first part. So this is getting to be old hat for you guys at this point. I used a laboratory to field approach where I measured, or I developed a accelerometer GPS collar and calibrated it with captive wolves. And again, each behavior generates a unique accelerometer trace. So as long as we can match this to a behavior, we can get an accelerometer trace from a wild wolf and then reconstruct the sort of behavioral diary of the animal. And while working with captive wolves, I also looked at the kinematics and biomechanics of these animals running. And this was one of the highlights of graduate school for me, was getting this data from a wolf running at 30 miles an hour. It was just really impressive to behold. So once we had these collars calibrated for both energetics and behavior, we deployed them on wolves in interior Alaska. Now that deployment lasted for a total of 8 months, from March to October. And we had a total of 19 wolves monitored in 9 packs. 3 packs in the west, 4 in central Denali, and 2 in eastern Denali. Now 14 of these 19 collars were only giving us GPS information, so telling us about where the animals were on the landscape. The other 5 collars were those collars I just described, the accelerometer-equipped GPS collars. And we very intentionally deployed these on 5 alpha male individuals so that we could get a comparison across the park. And just to put this all in perspective, generated from these 5 collars alone, almost 14 trillion rows of accelerometer data analyzed. So thank you to those of you in this room who really helped me figure out how to do that. It's a big data problem. So this is just an overview of Denali National Park. It's the map of the study site, and you can see the outline of the park in green. What you'll notice is these different dots are the GPS locations of the animals. The colored ones are from the accelerometer-equipped animals, and the white ones are from the GPS-only wolves. And you'll notice there's sort of 3 blobs here. This is Western Denali, Central Denali, and Eastern Denali. And as I was flying around the park, getting sick, as Terry mentioned, I did manage to look up from my barf and notice these parts of the park are really different from one another. Western Denali is lowland boreal spruce habitat. It's very flat, and there's not a whole lot going on there. In comparison, Central Denali has all these big river bars, it's got more shrubs and willows, and it's much more upland habitat. And Eastern Denali is much more mountainous, very alpine. And of course, as you may suspect, these habitats support different prey for wolves. So we've got salmon, moose, caribou, and Dall sheep, all consumed by prey in different proportions. When we look at the relative prey availability across the park, you notice that the salmon availability declines going from west to east, but ungulate prey density goes way up as you go east in the park. And a recent study by Lane Adams showed that the western part of the park has 78% lower ungulate density than the eastern part of the park. So jumping into my results, I found that wolves occupying this low ungulate density western region have smaller packs, which is not really surprising. We noticed that the smallest territories were actually of wolves in the eastern part of the park, and that as a result, wolves exist at higher densities in the eastern part of the park. And I just wanted to make sure that my 2015 results were comparable to a more longitudinal data set. So I compared them across 30 years from the mid-80s and found that, yeah, basically the wolf density has always been, or at least for the past 30 years, it's been greater in the east. And as you go west, wolf density tapers off considerably. So we then looked at the daily movement patterns of all these GPS and accelerometer-equipped wolves. And we found that for the western and eastern packs, there's really nothing too big going on seasonally. So this is March to October, all 8 months. However, as you can see, wolves in central Denali have this huge spike in distance traveled in the summer. And my first thought was, why are they traveling like so much farther than wolves on either side of them in the summer? It turns out that the Denali caribou herd migrates seasonally through the park. And this little blue polygon here is their winter distribution, and yellow is their summer distribution. So they sort of shift their range more into these higher elevation areas and even farther east in the park in the summer to give birth to their calves. And I worked with Lane Adams to basically compare the home range overlap between my wolves and caribou that he had radio collars on. And we found that there's actually a huge decline in caribou available to wolves in central Denali in the summer. And as a result, wolves farther east have more caribou available in the summer. So what we think might be going on here is that these farther travel distances by Denali wolves, at least in the central part of the park, they're moving farther to track increasingly scarce prey over the course of the summer. Okay, so I then looked at the daily activity patterns of these animals, and just to remind you, we used captive animals to basically match these accelerometer signatures with behaviors that we cared about. And then we developed what's called a random forest behavioral classification model to take, again, these raw signatures, which might not look like anything, and translate them into behaviors that we care about. And when we looked at comparisons across wolves, we found that wolves tend to be active for about 40% of each day, regardless of the individual and regardless of the region. And we further looked at a more higher resolution behavioral classification model, and we found that wolves are actually sleeping for about 5 hours or less each day, which I thought was kind of interesting. They're pretty active. When we looked by season, we found really that there was no pattern, or at least no change in activity patterns. They're basically active about 40% of the time, regardless of what time of year it is. And the same was true at the higher behavioral resolution. Okay, so we looked at movement patterns, we looked at activity patterns. What about daily energy expenditure? So for the entire deployment from March to October, we noticed that a typical wolf is burning about 17,500 kilojoules per day. And unless you're a physiologist, that number really doesn't mean anything to you. So that's roughly equivalent to about 7.5 Big Macs of calories per day. That's a lot of calories. We also noticed that wolves in central Denali had lower daily energetic costs than wolves, again, on either side to the east or west. So we broke this 8-month deployment down into 3 sections, spring, summer, and fall, and found sort of some contrasting patterns. So in western Denali, there might be a few things going on. Some wolves don't seem to have any seasonal trend in their daily activity patterns. In other wolves, it seemed to be like the longer we left the collars on, the more calories they were consuming on a daily basis. But in other parts of the park, there was maybe a declining trend. And it's cut off. What I wanted to point out here is that we're missing the summer and fall data from wolf 1507M because unfortunately it was legally harvested right on the border of the national park, just 50 days into our study. So we didn't have that data to work with, but I'd be very interested to see if it matched this pattern or if it looked like one of the other regions. Okay, so we looked at daily activity expenditure. What about hourly? We found that the typical wolf in Denali expends about 700 kilojoules per hour. And because in Santa Cruz we can't really relate to eating Big Macs, we can't relate to eating vegetables. Wolves actually consume about the same number of calories in an hour as a human eating a single veggie patty, but a single veggie patty every hour for a 24-hour day. So that's like 24 veggie patties a day. We also noticed that there was some variation, a surprising amount of variation among individuals in terms of their daily energy expenditure. So even within the same region. So let's look at just this western region in blue. Wolves, this wolf had more of a diurnal pattern. It was mostly active during the middle of the day. And again, same region, this other wolf, this sort of had like a crepuscular pattern where it was active most at dawn and dusk. And then some wolves were sort of active all the time. So there seems to be quite a bit of individual variation going on, and that could be due to all sorts of things. Prey, whether or not they're raising pups, etc. Okay, so we combine all of these activity models and the energy expenditure models, and we sort of forecasted out, okay, what is a typical wolf going to need to consume on a yearly basis in terms of moose, caribou, sheep, etc. And I made a number of sort of simplifying assumptions to run this model, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody after the talk about the parameters that I used to run the model. But basically what I came out with is that a typical wolf expends about, or needs to consume approximately 3.5 kilojoules of prey per day to survive. And if you extrapolate that out to a pack of 5 wolves over the course of the year, that's over 6,000 megajoules of energy. So a pack of 5 wolves, at least according to this model, would need to consume about 33 moose over the course of the year, or 1 moose every 11 or 12 days. And in terms of caribou, that's about 74 caribou, or nearly 200 doll sheep, or some combination of these animals. They're probably not going to just eat moose or just eat caribou. They'll take whatever they can find, whatever they can catch. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that my numbers were making sense, so I compared them to previous estimates. And for activity, just to remind you, I got about 40% active per day from each wolf. That's right within the previously published range. Daily distance traveled, I calculated about 18.5 kilometers a day, and the summer average for wolves is right around 19, so that's spot on too. And the daily energetics for these animals was within 1 or 2% of the field metabolic rates that have been previously measured. So I feel pretty confident that this laboratory to field approach that we've been developing in the lab can give us reliable estimates of not just one of these things, but all of them. I think that's the power of the technologies. We can get all these things at once, whereas in the past there'd be detailed focal studies just trying to get activity budgets from wolves. We're just trying to get energetics, and we can actually combine all these things with one sensor. Okay, so going back to my main question, what did I find? How is habitat prey heterogeneity affecting these patterns? Well, again, in western Denali, where ungulate prey are less available, I saw smaller pack sizes. Each small pack had a larger territory, and overall the wolf density was therefore lower. And energy expenditure among these wolves was also really high compared to east and west. So these higher daily energy expenditures, both the mean and the maximum for wolves in western Denali, seems to suggest that these wolves might be more challenged at maintaining positive energy balance on a daily basis. And a recent study showed that, yeah, the wolves have to sort of compensate for the low ungulate prey density by consuming salmon at approximately 1/5 of their diet. So lucky them that they have salmon out there. Okay, I hope I've shown you that the environment, both the physical and the biological environment, can shape wolf movement patterns and costs. But just to hit it home one more time, this is the movement patterns of a single individual in the eastern part of Denali in the Grant Creek Pack. And we can see him traversing these enormous mountain ranges. This is the Alaska Range, and these passes are over 3,000 meters. So the wolf is going back and forth to do something really interesting. His den is down in the south of the range, but the majority of the prey at this time of year were to the north. So he's actually cruising every week or so across the Alaska Range, which is really impressive. And again, the physical landscape sort of constrains his movement to be going through those passes. So just as the environment can shape wolf movement costs, wolf movements and patterns and costs can actually shape the environment, again, through these indirect effects and trophic cascades. So to sum everything up, I hope I've conveyed to you that all dogs are not created equal, that some dogs are just better runners than others, even though to the untrained eye they might look the same in size or age. I've also shown you that using animal-borne technology, we can actually measure fine-scale locomotion on the landscape, and we can actually detect sort of physiological constraints between ambush and cursorial predation modes. And finally, with the Alaska work, we were actually able to detect seasonal, regional, and individual level differences across these wolves. And again, it seems to be quite a valid approach given the fact that we had nice alignment with previous estimates. So I just wanted to leave you guys with one thing, and that is as wolves continue to recolonize the lower 48 states, there's tremendous potential for conflict with basically livestock and farmers in places that wolves used to have free range over. Wolves have been extirpated from much of the West for 100 or more years now, and since that time there's been lots of development, there's been ranches, all these things put up. And again, there's potential for conflict as these big carnivores with their big appetites are coming back and recolonizing the West. But what I think the team and I have been able to do through this dissertation is to not only develop a tool, but a whole laboratory to field approach that allows us to, again, map the energetics of these animals, look at their prey requirements, and hopefully that's going to be a really powerful conservation and management tool to mitigate further conflict with this species, but also to promote its really critical role in the fabric of the landscape. So with that, I've been talking long enough. Thank you all for listening. I have to thank